Good morning. Welcome again to Coffee Time with Masterminds. And thank you for joining us today. As always, we're inviting you to grab a cup of coffee and join us for a half-hour conversation about issues that are urgent to the leaders of mission-based organizations. Please let us know that you're here. Tell us your name and where you are joining us from in the comments. We have viewers from all around the world, and we love to know where you're coming from. Since we began, Cynthia, Rebecca, and I have been sharing our insights and knowledge with leaders of mission-based organizations on issues related to fund development, leadership, data management, fundraising. One area that leaders are dealing with these days is financial planning. How do we plan, given so much uncertainty? So, understanding how important this topic is, we have brought in a guest who's been working with nonprofit leaders in this time. Are you preparing your 2021 budget right now, or wondering if you need to amend your 2020 budget? Well, Ellen Sturgis is here to help. Ellen is the principal of Night Heron Consulting, and she'll be sharing what leaders should know and do given these situations. My name is Peta Blakely. I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting, and I help mission-based organizations measure and maximize their impact. I'm joined today by Rebecca. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Peta. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I'm Rebecca Tuttle. I'm the founder and creator of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. We help schools, nonprofits, organizations, and businesses find, write, and secure grant funding, and we teach you how to do it.
And we're joined by Cynthia. Good morning, Cynthia.
Hi, Peta. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Rojas, and I am the founder and principal of To Your Growth, which is a management consulting firm that specializes in organizational development, change management, and leadership development. Yay, it's Friday.
Happy Friday.
Good morning, Ellen.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Ellen has over 30 years of experience with nonprofit organizations in finance and operations in a variety of sectors. She is currently an independent consultant, and she offers interim CFO services as well as expertise in redesigning financial and operational systems. Today, she's going to help us make sense of what the unknown future could look like. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So, Ellen, tell us, what are you seeing? What is going on right now?
Well, it's been an interesting, obviously, 5 months or so for all of us. I think, it started out being people were in panic. They were like, this is going to be a few months. What are we going to do until this gets over? We were delaying fundraisers until the fall. And I think now what I'm seeing is people starting to take in like, yeah, this is a long-term change. We're going to have to think about long-term impact on our programs, on our fundraising, on how we do business on a daily basis. And that's where the real challenge is, but it's also, I feel like it's a more positive way to look at it. I've seen some organizations do incredible, adaptability, I guess I would say, where they're seeing quickly that they can, really adapt. They're still stay true to their mission, but do it in a more virtual setting. And that's exciting.
That's an interesting adaptation that we've been seeing, how people maintain their mission while they're divorced from their physical space.
Right. And, one of my clients is a summer camp, and they, that was that. There was no real way they could do anything. Another program that's more of an after school program, they immediately said, well, we're not just about teaching science. We're actually about supporting the girls that are in our programs that are coming from, pretty disadvantaged homes and don't have resources and don't have support. And so they started really quickly to a way, how do we support our girls, having weekly meetings with them, doing, a sort of online, sort of virtual science club, some really creative ways. But I think it helped them expand almost what their mission was, to see that the core was really about supporting these girls, thinking big, regardless of whether it was science or whatever.
That's a theme that has come up so many times on this show, is that idea of getting back to basics and understanding our core missions.
Yeah.
I have a question, Ellen. A couple of episodes ago, we had a gentleman on who talked about the differences between innovation and adaptation. You mentioned that you're seeing a lot of nonprofits adapt. Are you seeing innovation?
I mean, it's an interesting, where's the line between those two things? I think it is, I'm seeing both, I mean, I think adapting still feels a little short term almost. Where,
You're right, yeah.
When you start seeing, like, is there another way that we can meet our mission that doesn't require being face to face? I think that's a more of a longer term change. And I've definitely seen that as well. I mean, the more we get into this, the more we're going to see that innovation, because if they don't innovate, they probably aren't going to be around a year from now. That adapt is not necessarily going to be enough, because who knows how long this lasts, right? So
yeah.
And I think we all hope they'll go back into person to person things, but reality is.
Part of that innovation, Ellen, is sometimes associated with a cost, as I'm sure you can attest to. I wonder if, because we are transitioning some of our organizations remote and the physical space might be too large to come back, do you recommend that organizations maybe look at the size of their physical location to use those resources that they would be paying for that large space to maybe put towards some of that innovation?
Well, I think, the challenge is that some of those agreements for that space are not short term. They have multi-year leases, or they might even own their space. So I don't know that I would recommend yet giving up 100% of what that physical space is, but I think I've seen in my clients that they're not spending as much as they used to spend on the physical space. You don't buy office supplies, you don't buy even food or whatever for the office. And, it's not big money necessarily, but I think there's a number of things that we're going to be spending less on that can easily be sort of adapted towards more of this kind of, what's the best way to use for a virtual meeting, better cameras, better Zoom quality, whatever it is. And I think there's a lot of creativity to be, to move those funds around. I'm not sure that the physical space issues are going to make that much of a difference for now. I think it's going to be hard to get out of those short term.
That's interesting.
I'm seeing a lot of organizations coming together in terms of space, almost like a co-working shared space. So that's how they're downsizing, which I think is a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some organizations clearly, especially, of course, I guess I'm biased with mission-based organizations. It's so much about people. And so I think the biggest challenge, and this is sort of not on the finance side, but it's how do we keep that team, even just among the staff, how do we develop staff teamwork when we're not together as much or ever, physically. And so that's why maybe I'm a little hesitant to give up office space. And just think about ways that we can make that happen, virtually, so that we still keep our sense of team. Because
we have a guest coming up in the next couple of weeks who's going to be talking about teamwork when you're remote and getting stuff done. So.
Well, and it goes back to the discussion you all had around self-care and sort of care, right? It's like we need to make sure that we don't forget that the ways nonprofits function is because of people, whether it's the staff or our clients or our participants.
Yeah. So I have another question. So we know that leaders today are being pulled and they're being asked to do a lot of things that might be new to them. If you're lucky, you have a CFO or a strong CFO, right? But some don't. And so what are some things that leaders who don't have someone like you should be thinking about in terms of long-term projections, given that there are many unknowns, including a big unknown of state funding and probably federal funding? What should they be thinking about?
Right. Well, the first thing I like to remind people is that, budgeting is a tool. It's not the be all and end all. Like, we should be thinking about what our mission is, what our programs are, what do we want to accomplish before we start even looking at numbers? 'Cause I know that numbers intimidate people, right? They don't want to be talking about numbers necessarily, especially when they're not the CFO and they're not the person watching the numbers. So I think that's the first thing. But I think what's really important right now is because we are sort of overwhelmed with the unknowns. We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know what the future brings, in terms of budgeting, whether it's grants from foundations or the state or the federal money. So I think breaking down our future, saying you don't have to do a year's budget right now, especially if you just started your new fiscal year and you're sort of looking at a budget you might have passed in May and you're like, yeah, this isn't going to work anymore, or maybe passed before that. But I'd say, what do you see for your programs in the next 6 months? And look at, there's things that we know are core to what we do that we have to do, whether we're in person or not. And so those are the things. You start splitting up your budget to the most critical drivers, I guess was the best word to say, what do you absolutely need to keep doing? What are things that maybe just go on hold for some period of time? And I guess my message or my key recommendation is don't get freaked out by not knowing what a year from now is going to look like. If you do it by a quarter, then do it by a quarter. If you can do 6 months, do 6 months. But sort of look at your numbers and your organization based on the key things that you really want to keep going, and start from there. And then maybe there's things you just have to put on hold that you had planned in your budget, whether it was from 3 months ago or 6 months ago, that just aren't realistic right now. Because it has to be in person, or it would require a whole bunch more work and more staffing up that is just not realistic right now. I mean, I think we have to give ourselves a break, and say this is normal times. Nobody's done this before, and then when you're talking to funders, whether it's, state and federal, the faces might be harder to find, but I think particularly with foundations, keeping them in the loop and letting them know, like, the grant that we got for X program might not happen until January. Are you okay with that? Can we use the money for something else? Keeping in touch with those funders. Because we're all in the same boat. The funders are going to wonder where their funding is going to come from, right? So I think we just have to all give ourselves some breathing room and start breaking things down more.
That's a great idea. I didn't realize that nonprofits could do a 6-month budget if
Right.
so much unknown. I didn't even think of that. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I know.
We had spoken earlier in a few episodes. It was actually, I think, in one of our earliest episodes about the flexibility with budgets and funders during COVID. Some funders will allow you to take your whole grant budget that they were awarded you and use it toward emergency COVID relief and set aside the program that your budget was supporting through that grant that was awarded before the pandemic. So I really like what you're saying, Ellen, about reminding people to keep in communication with your funders and also to treat your budget with respect and have the people who know how to write them and monitor them involved in the process, but also keep it flexible.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important just to it is just a tool. You don't have to stick to your budget just because you have a budget. It was to help you move forward the organization, and the goal is still moving forward the organization. So if the numbers have to be switched around, they have to be switched around. And I'm people who've worked with me would say, but Ellen, you're always saying don't change your budget. Well, this isn't a good year,
Right.
Don't need to change your budget,
Nobody's on plan this year. Somebody once said to me that the budget is where the organization operationalizes its values.
It's a perfect way to put it.
Oh.
And so I think what Ellen is saying, which is such a great takeaway, is, what is your most important value right now? Maybe that's the only program you're going to budget for, both in terms of money and staff resources and time and all those other things.
Right.
Yeah.
I've always, very similar to what you just said, is if you've got a plan for your organization, but it doesn't show up in funding in your budget, then you're not going to get there, right? So you need to have your plan, and then you figure out, well, what resources do you need? Because it's all the budget is putting resources towards meeting the mission, right? So
Right. Yeah.
I love that. I love that idea. This is awesome.
I think it also has to, people, they get intimidated by finance and by budgeting, and that's when it, like, take it back, own it, this is just a tool I'm going to use to make my organization move forward.
Well, you keep using the word tool, and you're probably doing that intentionally.
Yeah.
I've never thought of it that way. And so you're right. It is a tool and should not own you, right? And intimidate you as a leader. It should serve as a guide map, right? Toward what becomes important and what you need to focus on. So I like that reframing. It's a tool. But some organizations are 24 days into their new budget.
Mm-hmm.
And some, if they're operating in a calendar year, are probably thinking about next year's budget. And so I think one of the questions we also had was, if you have a budget and it's getting off the rails, do you change your budget? Do you adapt it? What do you do with a budget that it is no longer relevant, let's say 2-3 months in, because there's so much unknown?
Right. Well, and as I said, I'm usually the first one to say, nope, you can adjust the budget, you can adjust your plan for the year, but you don't play with the actual numbers. But this year, I would say, and whether you're into it just a month or months, 6 months into it, I think it's time, at this point, if the organization, if the key staff and the key leadership of the board get together and say, well, what do we want to accomplish, in the next 6 months and the next year, based on what we know today? Because I'm dealing with college students who are like, how can I make a decision? I don't know what it's going to look like in 3 months. Well, you know what? You got to make a decision based on the information we have today. So let's, if your organization's comfortable saying, like, it seems like most of my clients are looking at this point, well, the fall is sort of a wash. I mean, we're going to assume this is going at least until the first of the year. So same with funding, same with programs. Well, then you think about, what are your key drivers? What are the key things you want to accomplish over the next 6 months? It might be a total, like, you need to sort of step back and think, work with specialists to, like, how can we meet our mission in a new world, and that might mean you're not doing active programming with your clients, but you're doing things internally. So then you need to budget for that. You need to figure out, well, do we have the funds to, to support bringing in a couple consultants to help us think through a new way of doing our mission or meeting our mission. But I think you pick that period, and I think it takes just the key leadership to talk it out, to think, like, what's the worst can happen, sort of the way in the past we might have 3 versions of a budget, best case.
Yeah.
Well, right now it's sort of like, if maybe those 3 things are, we reopen in January, we reopen next June, worst case, and then something in the middle, so I think, it's just about breaking it down. We got to start, we just the same, all the themes around taking care of ourselves, but we have to, we got to be real. This is the information we have today, and we don't want to leave our clients hanging, so by September, we're going to be ready to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, I'm watching like food pantries in my community and other areas, saying, okay, well, how do you do a food pantry when you're not supposed to touch anybody or talk to anybody, And they figured it out, and that's because the fundamentals, like, we need to get food to these people. And I think it's the same way for all of us, no matter what our mission is. We need to, like, say, what's the key thing we need to get done, and how quickly can we do it, and then move into different phases.
Another thing that Rebecca keeps reminding us is that your funders are your friend, are your partners, and that they want to help. Foundations have been amazing in stepping up and providing funding. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I'd be interested to hear how nonprofits are negotiating those relationships during this time. Rebecca, that's your mantra.
Sure. It's important to note here that budgets, I think, for most grant writers is the most intimidating section of the proposal, aside from probably the evaluation piece, which, Peta, would you say that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
It's important to note that there is flexibility in creating and designing the budget, but once you submit it, it's pretty much final. However, we're in the midst of a pandemic, so the funders are going to anticipate some flexibility or modifications to that budget. I think it's really important to note that there's two different budgets that we submit to funders. One is what Ellen's talking about, which is your overall organization's budget. And that's the one you have the most flexibility with internally. And then you have your project or your program budget that really is the one that the funder is funding. And you have flexibility for that budget based on the funder, your communication with the funder. And if something's going wrong, if you had to shift gears, it's so important that you talk to funders along the way and when that happens, instead of waiting until the end of your project and saying, oh, well, we changed things or this didn't work out. You have to have that ongoing communication. But what I always tell my students and clients is, before you pick up the phone and talk to the funder about the struggle or the difference in the budget, have a plan. Say, this is what's going on. This is how we shifted. And this is what we propose to modify our budget going forward. And they'll probably give you permission to do so if it's within reason.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question before we continue that. I think it's a good question. Oh, you blocked out half of us. Sorry,
Yeah.
Ellen.
It's a long question, so it's covering your face, Ellen, but it's a very good one.
As one of the crisis directors in New York, this is from May. May joins us each week. So hi, May, how are you? She's saying she needs to constantly train her crisis teams and principals on trauma, procedures, and protocols for the reopening in September. Because of the uncertainty of what's happening and what will happen in September, their budget director is constantly giving her pushback. How can she start the conversation that training is just as important as other factors, for example, instruction, which is one of the factors that the Department of Education focuses on? And it looks like her question might be two parts, but I don't see the second part. Oh, wait a second. Here it is. Good, thanks.
Well, I mean, I think it goes to that core of like, okay, what's your first step? You know, you've got a goal of starting up in September, and you know, the sort of key function or the key service you're providing is that support, and you have to have your staff trained in order to reopen. So to me, that's a core part of your business, or you know, of the work you're doing. So therefore, it has to be priority in the budget. You know, there might be other things that you're not going to need. I mean, you're doing remote support, whatever, you know, there's other things that might be able to be put on hold for a few more months, but you can't reopen in September if your folks aren't trained. So I would just say to the budget director, no, this is core to what we're doing. You know, it's not fluff. And if her concern is that it's not part of that state funding, well then, as Rebecca says, call the state funder and say, I just want to make sure that when you talk about instruction, you're talking about training my staff, because this is new stuff they have to manage. They need to be ready.
I wonder also, and this is interesting, Ellen and I were talking about this right before we came on the show, about the tension that is often experienced between CFOs and CEOs, right? So leaders are about big picture, organizational development, growth, and then the CFO has access to the numbers, and so they see the reality of the situation, and that creates a tension sometimes. And I wonder, so May could go to her budget director and say training is important, but there are probably other directors saying the same thing about other things. And so what I wonder is, can she give examples to why it's important? So if her team does not get trained in XYZ, this is the impact that will have. And then start to develop that argument from a data perspective, a fact-based perspective, to help the budget director see why it's important. Because I think the budget directors are getting stuff thrown at them. Everybody needs more resources because this is so new to us.
Right.
Why? The why and the what if. What if we don't fund this might be a good way to start the conversation.
Right. Well, and I think that tension clearly is going to be there. I mean, that's what budget people are supposed to be doing is saying, we don't have the resources, you're putting too much here or there. But I think that's why, in the beginning of this sort of process of rethinking your budget, whether it's because it's 6 months old or a month old, really thinking through the scenario options and breaking down that calendar and saying, we, in the next 3 months, we need to X, Y, and Z. And, it's the leadership, whether it's the executive director, leaders from the board, there's some core people that have to be involved in that discussion. Could be the senior leadership team, including the budget director, but talking through what do we absolutely need to get back, in the program, like ASAP. And I think having everybody thinking through that and making that timeline, that'll help everybody to understand where the resources need to go at different times. And clearly, back to the funding you might already have, it's like, well, that wasn't the plan. We had other things we had gotten grants to do X, Y, and Z. And again, as Rebecca was saying, well, if you need to adapt that, it really has been remarkable, at least in our area, just how many times I've heard from clients that the foundations are really being incredibly supportive and flexible on where the funding is going, even to the extent of these fundraisers that everybody was planning galas and everybody, the funders knew what the promotion was going to look like because everyone's going to be in person and they're getting a bag with their logo on it or whatever. And now it's like, yeah, that's really different. The reality, I mean, that's a whole other issue, but I think, starting there.
May says social emotional learning is always left for last, and that's one of the biggest frustrations of her job. I have a question for PETA.
Yeah.
PETA, evaluation is huge in nonprofit work.
Mm-hmm.
How can you tell us a little, just because I'm really curious, how do you recommend or how do folks go about modifying evaluation when they're making these budget cuts or budget changes that we're talking about?
Yeah, right. So I think my response is going to be a little bit like Ellen's. There's so much uncertainty that maybe year-long plans are irrelevant, and maybe what you thought your program was going to look like is irrelevant. And it's about whittling back to your most basic and fundamental values. So what I would recommend to people is what does it really look like to show up for the community that you serve right now? What does that mean for your organization to be showing up and bringing value in your community? And how do you measure that? And you may very well be letting yourself off the hook for your long-term outcomes and some elements of your program that were an add-on, and you're just going to be meeting basic needs right now. That's completely okay. You are probably going to be modifying how you measure things. So surveys that you might have distributed on paper are not going to happen on paper this year. And it legitimately might not be worth your time to come up with an additional or a different way to do some of these measures if that's not the most important thing you can be doing right now. Just like we've talked about before, go back to your funders and say, there's been a change. Here's what's going on. And maybe this means that we've changed how our program is designed, and this is how we're going to be measuring that now. How does that fit in with your overall vision as a funder?
That's awesome. But it still remains important. And you've also been advocating to, I forget what you call it, but to journal your innovation.
Oh, yes, learning journals. Yeah.
Learning journals. Journals.
And I think there's a corollary in the financial world. So here's what we planned. I mean, this is why your budget has an actual column right next to it. Here's what we planned. Here's what happened. Here's why that happened. Right. So same thing for your organizational changes. Right. Here's what used to happen. Here's the resource that was unavailable, like our classroom, or the need that was more urgent, like distributing Chromebooks, or teaching people how to use the technology that their child had brought home from school, and just adapting your plan around that, and then documenting what was the rationale for the change that we made. Is this an adaptation to something that was missing, or an innovation based on a new opportunity in the field? And then how are we going to test it to understand that this is effective? Because some of these innovations may be things that we're going to keep.
Right.
We're almost running out of time. And if you guys don't mind, there is a question that I have, a burning question. I'm always thinking about staff, right? And staff are so dysregulated. One, because they've been impacted personally. Their kids, if they have children, have been impacted through school. They now have to bring the work to their home, and they don't know what's happening at the organizational level. How transparent should leaders be with the financial state of an organization with staff who are already dealing with their own stuff and their own dysregulation because of all the changes? Do you have an answer, Ellen? Do you have an idea?
Well, I would say, I mean, in general, I'm always a more open than not philosophy on finance. I think we need to demystify it for more people because we need buy-in from everybody. But that said, I wouldn't, you don't go into great detail, but I mean, it doesn't take, expertise to realize that given right now, everything's a question. Fundraising is a question, future funding from grants are a question. And I think being honest with your staff, saying, and giving them the good news as well as the question marks, saying, we just, talked to X, Y, and Z Foundation. They're letting us, loosen the reins on the money that they gave us this spring to make sure that we can keep going, generally, they're unrestricted money. So you give them the good news, but you also, just be upfront and just saying, we're trying to figure out, how we're going to be able to keep us moving forward in the next year. Welcome your thoughts, and keep the conversation going, because I think it is a scary time for everybody on so many levels. But jobs are critical to us, and we as nonprofit mission workers, feel really strongly about the places we work for. So even though it might not be, on the ladder of hierarchy, obviously your kids and your family are probably most critical, but they need to know that you're thinking about the problems and you're not going to act like everything's fine, because we know it's not fine. And I think being transparent to a point, you don't have to, the details do not have to be in everybody's head, but I think keeping your staff sort of abreast in the big ones and definitely sharing some good news as well as, some of the concerns that are out there, because
I think the good news is what's key.
Good news is key.
Yeah.
Cynthia, you have a comment here. May says, great question, Cynthia. But fear keeps them from being transparent, at least in her office.
Yeah.
And I feel like that can magnify the fear and uncertainty, because people will fill in stories when there's
exactly. I mean, we know that there's all this unknown. So if the ED or the CEO isn't talking about it, we are going to make up our stories, and we're going to assume it's even worse than we probably are. So I think, and you don't do it every day. You do a weekly check-in, whatever. But I think that's true no matter what the situation. Pre-COVID, post-COVID. I think we should, be more helping our staff understand some of the bigger picture finances.
Thanks, Ellen. This has been incredibly helpful.
Great. Thank you so much for helping. It was really fun.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.